The book is very much concerned with my personal experience. Growing up in Australia, a lot of it's got to do with things that I've actually been involved with, whether it's the Palm Island sequelae to the death in custody and the riots, and my dealings with the police in those circumstances, or some of the death in custody cases which we've been handling coronial inquests, and also the experience that I've had visiting Kalgoorlie, and the fact that there's, even to this day, curfews and banning orders and differentiation between the way that the police and the general population treat Indigenous people from the way they treat white people. And there's really a state of demoralisation in much of West Australia amongst Indigenous people because of their awareness of the fact that they're not merely second-class citizens. To some extent they're regarded as a blight on the landscape.
Jesus, mate, it don't real matter if you bash him till his black brains splatter, but make sure his cell is spanking clean and smash the lens which filmed the scene. The doctor'll say he somersaulted, hit his head, you won't be faulted. What's one less pisshead to his friends? Will say he dived and got the bends, or tried to hang himself and fell. Strayed from the dreaming into hell. The pollies won't dare point the finger no more than over Maralinga, Cherbourg, Doomadgee or Brewarrina. And Abo's just a black-arsed foreigner. No votes and tears over spilt black coffee. It's like biting into sticky toffee. Oh, they'll suck up to their dance and art, but in truth don't give a flying fart. So take no lip from the Murray race. Fuck land rights, put 'em in their place. Now if you see him twitch or quiver, just one stiff kick right in the liver. If the bastard stirs and cries, "I'll sue," just jump on him like a kangaroo.
In what the coroner doesn't know, I'm referring effectively to the events which led to the Palm Island riots in 2004, when Mulrunji Doomadgee was killed in police custody. And remarkably, the CCTV didn't film that section of the lockup where it appears that he was screaming and bleeding to death, having had his liver and spleen cloven in two by somebody or other, the only suspect being a police officer who said it was all caused by him falling over at the front door.
Hang down your head. Conceal your dark face. Avoid the taser and the mace. Hide your pigment from the other. Confide alone in your black brother. You're a figment of their minds, fear of phallus, hate defined in unrelenting cold disdain by their Badlands cult of ball and chain. They are complacent at the news that you're down and out and sing the blues, that you tried to hang yourself in jail and your family cannot raise the bail. It reinforces their self-worth to deny your basic rights of birth. Facing curfews, bans, incarceration, maintain the fight for your First Nation.
The poem Kkk Kalgoorlie obviously is a play on the Ku Klux Klan element, and it reflects the very disappointing experiences I've had in Kalgoorlie in representing pro bono some Indigenous people in circumstances. One case, a little 14-year-old boy was run over, it would appear deliberately, by somebody who was seeking to avenge the fact that he was driving his motor scooter that had been stolen, and killed him. And I represented the family in that situation and still continue to do so, and also represented some other people in the community who'd been, Indigenous people who'd been charged with offences, and the unequal treatment of the law of black people and white people, and the ease with which you can avoid serious punishment for feloniously killing a black child in Kalgoorlie is still a matter that causes me great distress. I'm a pretty provocative person, but you can get away with a lot more in poetry than you can if you actually say it more directly. It's a way of disguising the force of your passion in many ways, and validating it in a way that ordinary prose doesn't permit. If you said you can denounce and and rage against injustice and people and situations through poetry that you can't possibly do in prose, because in prose you'd be sued. In poetry it's up to interpretation to a large extent.
Brutality now means bravery. The rules have been rewritten. The state ordains, your repression stays, resistors will be smitten. You've no right to moan about your grief, the wages gone, the children seized. It's enough that we're at last confessing, so shut your mouths and count your blessings. In a state of nature bordering hell, what's left for him to do but rise up in anger and rebel against the murderers of truth? Then they shoot him with a taser to disable and to maim the cause which will expose them, where they scrubbed away the stain. They abduct him in the darkness, proclaiming they have won, the lynch mob in their posse, the squatters with their guns. Empanelled as his jurors, cloaked in statutes that enslave, they drag him from his sacred land, the Pharisees assuaged. He sustained by forebears spirits in a cell with just in cages, but cannot quell his dreaming of lost peace and hallowed places.
The poem called The Black Death, an Australian Tragedy in Many Parts is really about what happened to Lex Wotton, who was called the ringleader of the Palm Island Riots. I would rather call him the person who led the protest. He was the rebel who incited people to some extent to make a stand and to draw a line in the sand over the events on Palm Island in 2004 and the circumstances of his arrest and incarceration. It also refers to the fact that the Queensland government decorated some of the people that were most responsible for either giving or executing the orders which the federal court subsequently found to be racist. The conduct of police officers was not only condoned but endorsed, it seemed, by the Queensland government, and that's why the section of the poem that commences brutality now means bravery. The rules have been rewritten. The state ordains your repression stays. Resistors will be smitten. You'd be horrified and shocked to know how harshly riot and destruction of property is regarded under criminal law. It's treated with the same level of gravity as rape and murder, particularly in Queensland, where it can carry life imprisonment. And yet the people that cause people to respond in that way are not only condoned in their behaviour, but in this case were even decorated for it. I've been doing a lot of human rights work. I worked with Indigenous communities around Australia, and the willful blindness allowing generations of Australians to miss out on the bounties that Australia has to offer. They're just permitting injustice to be perpetuated. Even though I'm not a religious person, I was very much inspired by the language of the canons, as it were, the canons of Judaism. And so it was really the opportunity to perform in a religious scenario that really put me in touch with a kind of a spiritual connection with language and a kind of concept of God and justice, and that was all fused in language. The extent to which powerful rhetoric can be used to change history is something that people, I think, greatly underestimate.
The sea was warm and rougher than expected, resembling Israelis on both counts. Bodies thrashing half ejected and salt, plenty of salt. A white foam-fringed bath, the blue of cobalt. Some bobbing heads and corporeal mounds had survived killing camps, ringed with barbed wire mesh and the unfathomable ravages of the flesh. It had been a catastrophe like no other. Infants, adolescents and their mothers, under torture, death and degradation. Fanatics scourging just one nation. Dehumanised, demonised and doomed, the Hebrew polity entombed. Cheering on the carnage, peasants enthused for the mass destruction of the Jews who, dragging their crosses from their mangers, clawed the walls of shower chambers, washrooms from which no one came out clean. Medinat Yisrael is their pain.
The poem Overcome is written about my experiences in visiting Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, and just looking at many of the people swimming on Tel Aviv beach and thinking of what they've been through as Holocaust survivors, and harking back to the just horror of their experience and the fact that here they are now in Israel, in a country which effectively solved the refugee problems which would have beset Europe and the United States and Australia, for that matter, at the end of World War II, because there would have been millions more Jews to give sanction to if it weren't for the State of Israel. And this is one case where refugees and asylum seekers were largely allowed to create their own rescue plan and were able to implement it based upon their historical attachment to the land. And the fact that they were able to do it and achieve it is somewhat miraculous, but was facilitated by the horrific events which had preceded this happening, and the fact that I think that the West consider this an easy solution to a problem of their own making.
We are cells dwelling in infected tissue, starved of the oxygen of morality, depleted by hypocrisy and sickened by the virus of opportunism. Arrogance and zealotry burn too bright in blinding light, causing fever. Our soul suffers rejection through defensiveness, expunging conscience. From the compost of victimhood, we cannot long prosper in the name of God, under the exception of self-deception or the illusions of delusion. We may yet suffer a biblical fate, the death of our body as the temple of our soul, the third dismemberment of David's kingdom. Hear, O Israel, or just listen.
Recognising the injustice of anti-Semitism, the irrationality of anti-Semitism, reminds me of what the central obligation of a Jew was supposed to be, which was, as the only monotheistic people of the time who had the privilege of receiving the Ten Commandments, that we're supposed to be a light unto the nations, that we're supposed to carry reformist zeal and a passion for justice. That was the mission of what Jews were supposed to be charged with. That was the concept of being a chosen people. And that was something that I latched onto, and as a driving message to me, it's a theme of my life. And one of the things that Rabbi Hillel is famed for having said thousands of years ago, before he was martyred by the Greeks, was, if not now, when? If not me, who? And I think that's the driving adage that drives, that compels me in my life, that now is the time and I am the person that has to do it. Nobody can pass the buck and nobody can shirk the responsibility that life has to do whatever they can to make things better.
We cannot win. You would not let us win. We wear the seminal stain of original sin. We let him die. Could we have staunched his pain when it was all precast and also preordained? The Romans stole your hearts and minds. The guilty henchmen got away, but you pinned us as accessories in your twisted passion play. For you, the occupation dates from 1967, though we had our sights on Israel since Jews ran out of Lebanon. Prior to 1948, there was no Palestinian Arab state. We weep for the Arab refugees, yet when we were burning, deaf to our pleas, you locked us out of everywhere. And now you denounce us and declare that we are nothing, have nothing, were nothing. And Palestine is theirs. Their Nakba was our liberation. Were it not for us, no quest for nation. Their strong men had their own agendas, almost lost on their avengers, who in their wild yet proud resistance leave us no doubt. They'd go the distance. It was not our leaders, but their own, who had them grovel at their thrones to exploit despair and deflect their blame, so the Jews instead should bear their shame. Because we fear their rampant rage, they remain in lockdown in their cage, while you abjure, incite, appease, to bring us stiff-necked to our knees and induce brash hope in the cruel and rabid, that their reward in store is the city of David. Let's face the facts, I am a Jew. You do not care, you already knew, and if you'd rather I was not a conspirator in the Jewish plot, then live with it, because I am real. Secular, and I will not kneel. My kid might win the Nobel Prize, but nothing saves me from your lies.
BDS is a poem that I wrote, it's BDS, as you may know, stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanction, and I called it the J to Z of hate because that takes you from the J for Jew to Z for Zionist, because to a large extent the denial of Jewish history and Jewish claims to the land of Israel, which the very people that are denying these rights and denying this history are people that adhere to or were brought up in the Christian tradition, when they must know that Jesus came from Jews and lived in Israel, and that the history of the Jews in Israel has a continuity and a history that modern revisionist, Chomskyite leftists want to deny. And the fact is that wherever you stand on the Middle East, and even though I never believe that anybody should live at or exist at other people's expense, you have to start from the premise of recognising Israel's legitimacy, Israel's entitlement to a Jewish state in the land of Israel, and from there you can proceed to try to work out what the solution should be to the Middle East problem. But you can't start from denying Israel's right to exist and Israel's legitimacy in history. The poem that I've called Trumps uses the analogy between what happens when you're on a plane and they tell you that something that's always very hard to accept for a parent, that if there's a problem with oxygen, you should take the oxygen mask first to make sure you're able to deal with the problems that your children will be experiencing. And it must be a very difficult thing for parents to accept and execute. This whole concept of putting yourself first, which has its contemporary reflection in Put America First, is something that can only be accepted if you're actually putting yourself first for the purpose of helping somebody else. If you're putting yourself first for the purpose of effectively stealing from others, for disadvantaging others, for acting in an unfair way, or if your primary goal in life is to make sure that you win at all costs and others lose whenever possible, and if your whole obsession with life is about making sure that other people lose, I think it becomes totally legitimate, and unfortunately that's what Donald Trump represents to the world today.
While your baby gasps, fumble with your mask, because until you get it right, not for you or for your infant will there ever be respite. That's what they tell you on the plane. Get your oxygen first to spare the pain. If you're too inept to do the trick, both not aspirating on the quick, then for you in store there's only grief, tragedy, loss and disbelief. Put yourself first is the call to arms. Can you do that without causing harm? If you act without hubris or conceit and forswear corruption and deceit, if your goal's to lead and not desert, to share success and not to hurt, then show the way and seize the helm so we might all prosper in your realm. It's not a sin to choose to win, but to connive that others lose.